Well, good afternoon to our in-person and online audience and participants. Welcome to this event on the title of which comes from the G20 summit communique in Indonesia towards the end of last year. Today's era must not be of war. A great sentiment, and one which propelled the editors at the Financial Times to make it into a headline, and to some extent a commentary, a response to the gruesome events resulting from Russia's assault on Ukraine a year ago. The German Foreign Minister Breenbok spoke the other day and said that since that G20 statement, which also covered specific admonition against nuclear war, that to some extent the norm, at least against the rhetoric of nuclear use or the implications or inferences of nuclear use issued by Putin and his acolytes, has declined, and that is a good thing. On the other hand, of course, we've seen the withdrawal from the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty announcement or partial announcement in the last day or two. So these are indeed unusually awful and frightening times. I'll talk a little bit more in our project and our speakers in a minute, but I'd like you to join with me for a little reflection, a couple of minutes of silent meditation on the anniversary of this particular assault, to think about the dead of this war and other wars and the suffering entailed. So if you will just join with me for a couple of minutes in that, and then we will resume. Thank you. Thank you. So in a moment or two, I'll introduce our first speaker and then our panel, main panel. And our first speaker will, in a few minutes after I've made some more introductory remarks, will be Robert Harrop. He is the Director of Sokogai International, United Kingdom, and Vice Chair of SGI Europe. He's been in this role for a decade, following a career at the bar dealing with human rights cases. He speaks regularly on the contribution that Buddhist philosophy can make to resolving global challenges, particularly environmental and climate issues, as well as peace and disarmament. And he lives in Buckinghamshire with his family. And indeed, hey, we have so much in common, a different dog. He has a lurcher called Whiskey, it says here. I didn't know that. Thanks, Robert. Following on from Robert will be three of the experts and activists from SCRAP. Henrietta Wilson, who will speak first. She works on policy-relevant research on armaments and arms regulation, teaches undergraduate and postgraduate level at UK universities, works on our weapons tracking project, and particularly on our new book, which we'll be talking about, as a visiting research fellow and PhD student at King's College. Lucy Tiller is a founding member and former chair of Youth for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, a global network of young disarmament activists, leaders and policymakers. She co-convenes the youth and student branch of the CND and is an advisory member of the Scrap Weapons Committee. But her full-time job is trying to rid the world of malaria. I'm surprised she has any time left. And Martin Butcher, policy advisor on conflict, international humanitarian law and armaments for Oxfam International. He leads their work on global arms control, worked on the 2014 Arms Trade Treaty negotiations, and researches the impact of arms flows on civilians in conflicts across the world. He has almost 40 years of experience working on arms and disarmament and arms control for NGOs in the UK, Brussels and Washington, DC. His most recent report on arms sales to Yemen, I think, resulted in the fact that he is being burnt in effigy in one part of Yemen and they're putting a statue up to him in another part, broadly speaking. And I'm sure he will talk more about that when he speaks with us. Our project on Scrap the Weapons, one might think, how can this possibly be relevant in such a dire time? The conventional, so-called, war in Ukraine grinds on with casualties, arguably over 250,000. We see war or rumours of war in too many parts of Africa, the Middle East, and East Asia. World military spending tops $2 trillion a year now, almost 10 times what it was 10 years, just a decade ago. And yet the momentum to putting the brakes on is slight. I was called by a journalist from the NATO summit in Madrid, I think it was last year, about the 2% increase that NATO was arguing about. And I said, well, you do realise that NATO outspends the Russians 10 to 1. So 2% on a 10% superiority, or 10 times superiority, what's the point of that? And he said, well, no one's talking about that here. I said, well, you have 5,000 of the world's finest journalists, and no one's noticed that we outspend our greatest adversary by 10 times. I don't think all the money has been spent on bribes, consultants, and bans. Even if half of it is spent on high-tech equipment, the Russians have to fear they are outclassed. So we are in a situation of peculiarly troubled and limited debate. And our great colleague Benoit Palapidas has written one of his great works, the most recent one, on the influence of the arms industry on funding supposedly independent think tanks around the world and how that skews our understanding and debate. And that is all too obvious, I think, in the way in which we are presented with these ideas. My colleagues will talk in more detail about particular aspects, but I just want to, as plainly as I can, spell out what we have in mind. And a good place to start is with the missiles raining down on Ukraine. At least 2,000 of longer-range missiles, which could have destroyed western Ukraine, Lviv, and made it look like Kharkiv and Mariupol, were scrapped, literally sawn up and chopped up as a result of the Intermediate Forces Treaty signed by Reagan and Gorbachev in the late 1980s. And although the Russians violated the treaty, they weren't able to produce, like sausages, in Khrushchev's terms, even more of these missiles, so that when it comes to attacking western Ukraine, they're reliant upon missiles fired from submarines or bombers. But very few people point this out, that the concrete results of the INF Treaty is denying Putin thousands of missiles, which otherwise he would be using to destroy western and central Ukraine, and which he does not have available to him. And that is, I think, of great importance, and one can focus on the demand from the peace movement, which was picked up by the Reagan administration, for 0 missiles, which they didn't think that Gorbachev would accept, but he did. And when they played the game of call my bluff, and he called their bluff, they had to sign the treaty. They had to go along with it at the time when there was a huge amount of public pressure. So one might suggest one might pick up that unlikely demand and look at zero missiles. One might look at the history of pressure for disarmament and arms control and say, as we do, with support from an increasing number of countries, Brazil in particular, that we need to get a new UN initiative on disarmament, a new session of the General Assembly, and we need to renew the idea for global weapons control. After all, from a technical perspective, it's a lot easier than to control industry that produces carbon emissions for global heating from a technical perspective. And yet somehow people think it isn't practical. Well, it is, and we offer in our little study group over the last few years two precision tools, we like to call them. One is, well, if you want to have a draft, a treaty on general disarmament that would eliminate weapons of mass destruction and control other military forces, then we offer a draft treaty text. And it's a treaty text made up of prior agreements that have controlled all these types of weapon systems, and most of which have been put through the shredder in the last 10 years by the Russians and the Americans. But nevertheless, those agreements were effective for a generation in helping a peace dividend and helping international security. So we, in a sense, have cut and pasted, produced a compendium of the world's most effective arms control and disarmament agreements and put them on the table to say, well, if you want to let's have this discussion. You have some treaty obligations to have this discussion, and here's how. And then, of course, people will say, well, the other side will cheat. Well, to a degree, and this is the work that Henrietta has led, this is a thing of the past. Not perfect, particularly in respect of biological weapons, but there was no question of the fact that President Putin had ordered huge amounts of military forces to the border of Ukraine. The question was whether he'd be stupid enough to think that they would work. I was one of those who thought they couldn't possibly be so stupid, because 200,000 soldiers did not go into 40 million people as a piece of arithmetic. And there was no way that the Ukrainians were going to accept that. But nevertheless, he went ahead and we got the disaster. But his troop build-up was entirely transparent to satellites. And whether it is human rights abuses or the concoction of particular massacres or not in Mali and elsewhere, the ability, anecdotally and individually, of private groups and governments to monitor military and other related activity is now incredibly high. And so on our website, you'll find a draft portal, a kind of experiment of looking at international inspection regimes. And in the book that Henrietta has led our production of, we brought in people from well-known organisations like Bellingcat and the New York Times. So we offer these two tools and are in dialogue with states and NGOs to take them forward. We hope, and I think we didn't really expect that we'd find a member of the BRICS to even be taking quiet diplomatic steps to advance this agenda, but we have, in the respect of Brazil, starting to convene some meetings with us in Geneva. We think that there's a considerable prospect of progress. And frankly, people always say, well, it isn't the right time, or what is the right conditions? Well, in my sadly quite long experience now, one gets progress in disarmament when people are frightened. And I think we have considerable reason to be frightened about the state of the world. There are no wise men in a cupboard who will pop out and save us. The leaders we have are the leaders that will have to deal with things if they spin further out of control. And certainly in this country, they at present don't inspire me with great confidence. You may differ. That's enough from me, except to say I hope you will stay with us for a reception at the end of the afternoon. I want now to invite Robert Harrop to take my place here, and he will take a few questions after his address about the work of Soccer Guy International.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Plesh, and thank you for inviting me to SOAS to be part of this important and and yes, very, very pertinent at this moment. So I'm going to start by introducing the Soka Gakkai. Some of you may be familiar with it as an organisation, but just to give a little bit of background. So I'm the director in the UK of Soka Gakkai International. We are a lay Buddhist organisation with our roots in Japan. The particular strand of Buddhism that we practice is called Nichiren Buddhism. Nichiren was a 13th century Buddhist reformer. And in the early 20th century, in 1930, a lay organisation, originally for teachers and educators, was founded called the Soka Kyoiku Gakkai, the Value Creating Education Society. And that became, after the Second World War, the founder of the Soka Kyoiku Gakkai was imprisoned by the militarist government. He died in prison in 1944. His disciple, a man called Jose Toda, relaunched the organisation, not just for people in education, but right across Japanese society, and it flourished in post-war Japan. In 1975, Soka Gakkai International was founded, and the place it was founded was on the Pacific island of Guam, and Guam was chosen because of its place in history as being a place of horrific violence as a result of the Pacific War. But it was chosen in order to use a Buddhist phrase to turn poison into medicine. So Soka Gakkai's activities for peace are, of course, linked to Buddhist philosophy. I think it's probably no surprise. People who know anything about Buddhism know that it's a philosophy, a faith, a religion that has peace and harmony at its core. The first historical Buddha, we often called different things in different traditions. In our tradition, we refer to him as Shakyamuni Buddha. Had a phrase where he said, the English translation translates as, it's important to kill the will to kill. So that was, to kill the will to kill was very much at the heart of his teaching. And of course, teaching compassion to take away suffering and to replace it with something positive and hopeful. After the Buddha's death and the teachings of Buddhism, as they spread across Asia, often following the Silk Road, the trading route, within a couple of centuries, the king Ashoka had put the principles of disarmament into action when, as a warrior king, he decided that he had committed too many atrocities. He converted to Buddhism, and what we would now call India, a vast proportion of it became under the auspices of the Buddhist philosophy. The tradition that we practice in the Soka Gakkai, I mentioned Nichiren as a reformer, lived in the 13th century. I just want to quote briefly from two of his letters, or two quotes from a letter. He wrote about the question of peace. He wrote, "If the nation is destroyed and people's homes are wiped out, then where can one flee for safety? If you care anything about your personal security, you should first of all pray for order and tranquility throughout the 4 quarters of the land, should you not?" So he was encouraging people to think beyond their own particular space. And then he gave what we see as the sort of the inner journey that it's important for Buddhist practitioners to go on. He said, "You must quickly reform the tenets that you hold in your heart and embrace the one vehicle, the single good doctrine of the Lotus Sutra. If you do so, then the threefold world, so the world that we live in, will become the Buddha land. And how could a Buddha land ever decline?" So his teaching that he set out in the 13th century became the philosophy that these educators in the 1930s adopted as their faith. And I mentioned his name, Jose Toda. In 1957, Jose Toda made a declaration about nuclear weapons in a stadium where he said to thousands of young people that it was important and to deal with the underlying philosophy that justified the holding of nuclear weapons. So the previous year, the Soviet Union had just developed intercontinental ballistic missiles, and Toda's view was that he was concerned about people talking about the importance of deterrence. And the phrase he used translates into English as ripping out the claws that justify any idea that nuclear weapons are a good thing. So the Soka Gakkai's peace activities really hinge particularly on the subject of nuclear weapons. So the third president of the Soka Gakkai, he's still alive, Daisaku Ikeda, he's just had his 95th birthday, but he has been writing an annual proposal to the United Nations. He completed 40 years. He started in 1983, and the last long-form proposal was published in 2022. And there, every year, the main topic has been how to move forward with disarmament, particularly nuclear weapons. But he's referred to a whole range of weapons, from nuclear weapons down to small arms. Soka Gakkai International, has been a partner of ICAN, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, since 2007. And we are co-sponsoring the ICAN Youth Summit ahead of G7 in Hiroshima in the 25th, 27th of April, with other organisations. Although he hasn't written a long-form proposal this year, on the 11th of January, he gave a statement on the Ukraine crisis and the no first use of nuclear weapons. And that's a much shorter document. I want to read a short passage from that. He said, having experienced firsthand the terror of teetering on the brink of nuclear war, the people of that time brought forth historic powers of imagination and creativity. Now is the time for all countries and peoples to come together to once again unleash those creative powers and bring into being a new chapter in human history. He also uses the image of a circle. He says, to use the example of a circle to describe the nuclear weapon state's responsibility to maintain self-restraint with regard to nuclear weapons use, the commitment expressed in the joint statement to prevent nuclear war would be an arc comprising half the circle. That's the statement that was given out at the beginning of last year by the leaders of the US, Russia, the United Kingdom, France and China. So it would be an arc comprising half the circle. This alone, however, is not enough to fully eliminate the threat of nuclear weapons use. I believe the key to resolving this challenge is for states to commit to no first use. During the NPT review conference, the SGI worked with other parties and NGOs to hold a side event at the UN focused on the urgency of adopting this principle. And I'm certain that if pledges of no first use can be linked to the January joint statement, this will form the arc that completes the circle, containing the nuclear threat that has long hung over the world. In this way, opening the path to finally making progress on nuclear disarmament. So that's the most recent sort of public statement on the question of nuclear weapons from Daisaku Ikeda. Regarding the special session on disarmament, he has twice referred to this in his annual proposals. In 2003, his proposal had a request in it, and he said, I propose that a special session of the UN General Assembly, attended by the world's heads of state and government, be dedicated to the cause of nuclear abolition. Not since the third UN special session on disarmament 15 years ago has there been an opportunity for a truly global discussion of the problem of nuclear abolition. Surely it's time for us to take earnest and concrete steps to realise a world without nuclear weapons in this new century. We must confront head-on this issue on which the fate of all humanity hangs. And then more recently, in 2019, there was a long section on the fourth special session of the General Assembly. And just to read a passage from that, here I would like to propose that a fourth special session of the General Assembly devoted to disarmament be held in 2021 as a follow-up to the 2020 NPT review conference. It should reconfirm the obligation for multilateral disarmament negotiations and set the basic goals of major reductions in arsenals and a freeze on their modernisation. It should also initiate multilateral disarmament negotiations towards the 2025 NPT review conference. And quoting Garcia Robles, who later would receive the Nobel Peace Prize, Ikeda says, "I hope that at this fourth special session, all states will follow his example with both earnest commitment and a readiness to compromise to achieve a consensus on disarmament of nuclear and other weapons. I further hope that sufficient opportunities will be afforded to representatives of civil society to speak at this session. At the first special session, representatives of 25 NGOs and 6 research institutes addressed the General Assembly, the first time that civil society made its voice heard in this way. For my part, I wrote disarmament proposals on the occasion of the first, 1978, second, 1982, and third, 1988 special sessions. During the second special session, the SGI organised the Nuclear Arms Threat to Our World exhibition at UN headquarters in New York. This exhibition, with its portrayal of the horrors of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, played a part in the adoption of the World Disarmament Campaign by the SSOD too. Since then, the SGI has consistently worked to promote disarmament education. Through activities such as holding symposiums related to a fourth special session, we will continue to amplify the voices of civil society calling for a world free from nuclear weapons." So this is a topic that is very important in the Soka Gakkai context and constituency. I want to end. Sometimes people, when I talk about Ikeda and his peace proposals, sometimes people say, does anyone read them? What actions are taken? Anwar al-Chowdhury, who was as an ambassador originally from Bangladesh, but had the position of Under-Secretary General of the United Nations, has written a foreword of a book called A Forum for Peace, which draws out the main themes of Ikeda's proposals. And he expresses his gratitude to Ikeda for his relentless enthusiasm and actions and suggestions for the United Nations, and many of his proposals have been adopted. So it's in that context that the Soka Gakkai has and continues to take action in this very, very important area. So that's what I wanted to share today. I'm happy to take any questions that there might be.
Thanks. Well, let's see if we can. I'm sure there will be a couple of questions. Thank you very much, Robert. I should say this is part of our ongoing effort to engage with faith communities at our events. We don't seek to summon every faith, every event, but to bring people in, as it were, in series in parallel. And this time it was Soka Gakkai and Robert. So a question or two, and then we'll move on to the panel.
Okay. The question is, don't you need minimum strength to keep the nation peaceful so that you can enter into necessary developmental missions, in this case, a war between Ukraine and Russia?
Well, the question is it peace through strength? I think is what it boils down to. And, well, the INF Treaty we mentioned came from a process of both armaments and dialogue. And at the moment we have $2 trillion worth of armaments and no dialogue. And it's time that we restored some balance, I would say. But I was answering the question, it was to you. I'm very rude. Sorry, Robert. Old habits die hard. You have a go.
Yes, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think Soka Gakkai is a pacifist organisation, but we also, we recognise that it's important for a sovereign state to be able to defend itself. And I think in the 13th century in Japan, one of Nichiren's closest disciples was a samurai warrior, and Nichiren never told him not to be a samurai warrior. He encouraged him to be the best human being that he could be. So I think it's in that context that we yes, to be looking at, of course, dialogue is really important, but also getting, really recognising what the, what the real issue is here, and it's not, it's not that it's getting to the point where a really frank and honest and careful dialogue can take place, and I'm not sure that it's that we're in the right sort of ballpark at the moment for that to happen.
If I might add, and maybe I'd be interested in your response to this. I think few people are aware that around about 1600, Japanese society was as adept with firearms and musketry and so on as were the Europeans. But the social destruction of firearms in Japanese society meant that there was a decision in Japanese society to outlaw firearms for almost 250 years, I think. And it's an interesting example, albeit within a limited geographical space, Japan being islands, of where society can come to a conclusion that certain armaments are too self-destructive. And in that case, perhaps also damaging to the samurai class. I don't know the detail, but it's a clear precedent and example. I don't know if it's something that you're doubtless aware of.
I can't comment.
Okay. Well, we'll see who else might be want to join in the discussion from the floor or online.
I have a question.
Please.
As a religious organisation, have you faced any challenges in these fields? It's a world that's not entirely guided by religion anymore, and secularisation is on the rise. So has it been difficult navigating?
Faced with the rise of secularisation and other challenges?
Have you faced any challenges because you are a religious organisation?
Well, I think yes. There are. It's an interesting time. I mean, I think when I've spoken about peace and disarmament, I've often the audience has been a mixture of people of faith or people interested in peace, and I'm aware that. The people who, in the Venn diagram, there are going to be some people who are not religious in that context. But I think because we recognise the importance of working together, solidarity in these things that's key. You know, it's never going to be one group that is going to be successful. It's working together. And I think that, as Elise Boulding, said, she was an extraordinary force for drawing people together. She really recognised and taught. She's sometimes called the matriarch of peace work. She recognised that different groups and different organisations need to work together. And I think she once said that if 5% of a society can be absolutely committed to achieving a task, then that will make a difference. And I find that incredibly reassuring that such a small proportion of a community can have a successful impact on seeing a change. So yes, there are challenges because, but the overriding importance is that we rid the world of things which create such extraordinary differences and inequalities.
Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Robert.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again for the invitation.
And hopefully you can... Thanks again. So, can I call upon my esteemed colleagues to come to the panel?
So thank you, Dan, thank you, Zara, thank you, Eloisa, and all the team that have made this meeting happen. I'm really pleased to be here. As Dan said, my name's Henrietta Wilson. I have a background in researching armaments and arms limitations, and it's really exciting to be part of this work that SOAS and the scrap team are doing. So I'm not going to speak for very long. I've been told to speak for between 7 and 10 minutes, so please save any questions you have. What I'm going to do is speak very briefly about the Scrap Weapons Project that Dan introduced us to, and then about some of the research that we've been doing that fits within that. In particular, I'm going to introduce a forthcoming book that we've been working on. So as Dan mentioned, the Scrap Project is all about building intellectual and practical tools that support disarmament. The idea being it's all very well to have big picture visions, that's important, but it's good to give the world guiding tools for how to operationalise and achieve those visions. Dan mentioned the Scrap Treaty, and he also mentioned that one element that we've been working on for a number of years is on treaty verification, the systems by which members of treaties build confidence that each other are not cheating on their commitments. And aligned with that, we've been looking at new forms of open source research, that is research that uses publicly available tools and information, and the extent to which these things can be part of a global weapons tracking service, and following on from that, questions around whether or how this could contribute to treaty verification. So we've had several outputs to this. Back in 2020, we had 7 webinars featuring open source research practitioners and really delving into the difference that digital tools are making to tracking and monitoring activities. Following that, we ran a series of interactive virtual cafes to build the community, the epistemic community of practitioners. There are recordings of the webinars on the Scrap website. There aren't any recordings of the cafes because they were all people in breakout rooms getting to know each other and considering specific questions that we set them. We also, as Dan mentioned, we've been trialling this idea of having a website that can be a portal to tracking tools worldwide. We've worked with the Worcester Polytechnic Institute over in America to design this. You can check that out on the internet. And coming up, most recent output that we've been working on is our book that's called Open Source Investigations in the Age of Google. It's due to be published later this year, early summer time. So I've kind of plugged our work. What I want to do now is kind of give you a bit more insight into what we've learned from these projects through introducing some of the core themes from the book. So it's been edited by me, Dan, and our colleague Ola Samuel, who used to be project assistant at Scrap. The book has 18 original chapters from open source research practitioners, journalists, experts from academia and think tanks. We're really grateful to them. They're a phenomenal set of people who accommodate prize winners and rising stars in this community. And between them, what they do is they outline different tools and techniques that they use for their open source investigations, ranging from people who use satellite imagery to watch the build-up of troops in Ukraine that Dan mentioned earlier, to people that are scraping online fora for evidence of violent extremism, to people who are using traditional media to get purchase on illegal proliferation. The chapters also showcase some diverse applications. We have people who are writing about how open source investigations can be used to track human rights abuses, nuclear proliferation, chemical weapons use. So there's a whole bunch of different applications being talked about. The chapters between them also consider the opportunities of these sorts of investigations, thinking about the extent to which they can enhance the possibility for transparency and accountability in global systems, as well as their limitations. For example, it's not always clear how to distinguish between good or bad open source investigations. And the chapters also address dilemmas facing this field. In particular, a really strong focus through the book is some of the ethical dilemmas that people face. How to keep practitioners safe, how to keep colleagues on the ground who are tweeting information in real time safe and not jeopardise them. And it's enormously difficult. So I hope I've given you a flavour. This is an enormously wide-ranging set of chapters. And so I wanted to say a bit about the rationale and vision that kind of underpinned this and why we designed it like this. And the first thing to say is that we have a strong belief that achieving human security is interconnected. That while in some cases it's really important to consider threats to human security in isolation. If you're designing an internationally legally binding treaty, it's quite important you define what you're looking at. Like some of the things Dan mentioned, you might define missiles, or you might define nuclear weapons. So there's a sense in which you categorise and you separate some things. Nevertheless, in a world where you are able to access digital tools to monitor things, there are opportunities here to look across threats to human security as well as within them. So, for example, in our interactive cafes and our webinars, we were firmly convinced to start with, and we became more so, that it makes sense to think about tracking weapons in the context of what the weapons are doing. So look at the effects as well as the technologies that are spreading. A second thing that we were really keen to showcase through the book was this sense that was a sense of the potential for open source investigations. And one really key thing here is that the new digital approaches to monitoring can really empower a diverse set of actors. So back in the 70s, back in the 80s, access to satellite imagery was really restricted to a few very well-resourced governments. Now, with open sources, it's not universal, but it does mean there's far better access to the sorts of tools that we're talking about. So, for example, under-resourced states can use a lot of these things. International organisations can, in theory, you have access to these technologies. It gets a little bit more complicated in terms of what they're actually allowed to do. But also, many non-governmental organisations and individuals can use this. So there's this sense that accountability and transparency is not in the exclusive hands of governments. I'm saying this very broadly. There are limitations to these, and I'm very happy to talk more about those in the questions. Another point that runs through our book is there's huge benefits of delving deep into single cases, becoming truly expert in allegations of use of chemical weapons or proliferation finance. But there's also benefits in taking an integrated approach. And the community that's emerging is doing a bit of both. There are deep diver experts, and there are also people that are working across issue areas. So it's a very exciting space to watch. So I'm now just going to give you some examples to try and kind of ground it in some reality, some examples that are taken from book chapters. The first one is an investigation into what you can see on the left is a still from a video that was circulating on Twitter that showed a horrific incident. What looked like soldiers marching two women with two very young children into the jungle and executing them. And it set up horror through Twitter. It also set up denials from the Cameroonian government that it was anything to do with them. So a set of online investigators self-organised through Twitter and also then became part of a BBC Africa Eye investigation and went through the video frame by frame. You can see on the right, they then tried to line it up with imagery from Google Earth. It was very labour intensive. It took a lot of people, a lot of hard work, but they managed to narrow it down to a particular location. They also managed to, using similar techniques, find the time that it had happened. Because if you're looking at shadows and you're looking at the topography, you can see which crops might, whether it's wet or dry. So they narrowed down a time and a place, and from that they could go to Facebook. They found the people that did it. As a result, people are in prison. There are definite outcomes. So that's one example from our book. Sorry, I should give credit. That's from a chapter by Ben Strick, an extraordinary investigator, really powerful work. The second example, I must say, of many that I could choose, comes from a chapter by Andrea Carboni and I'm sorry, I can't pronounce her name, Cloney Raleigh, from ACLED, who use a completely different set of open source techniques. Rather than going for the digital satellite imagery tracking, their organisation employs humans around the world to scan journalism, and then they triangulate what they find to get evidence, kind of solid, transparent evidence of cases of political violence around the world, including Black Lives Matter in America, Yemen. So getting really robust numbers about deaths and harms that are done around the world. Our book also includes chapters about what happens next. You know, you get a bunch of information, so what? We have chapters from Alexa Koenig and Lindsay Freeman from the Berkeley Human Rights Centre, who have devised this protocol which, if followed, means that the results from open source investigations can be used by the International Criminal Court. Several other chapters look at the way that open source research has really enabled decision making by the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. So this is not just finding stuff, publishing it. Investigations can really make a difference to decision making. Another chapter by Jeffrey Duke in South Sudan looks at practitioners on the ground, looking at what's happening in their communities from the proliferation of small arms and light weapons. At the other end of the spectrum, Hans Christensen and Matt Corder from the Federation for American Scientists have used the satellite-based open source investigations to reveal new Chinese missile silos. So what I wanted to do from giving this particular spread of examples was this sense of the possibilities for an integrated approach, that all of these people are doing something different, but all of them together give this very powerful sense of what's going on across the world, in the world of weapons. So I'm going to very briefly just kind of sum up with some reflections and conclusions. The first thing that I want to say that we're kind of motivated by in our team is that good decisions rely on accurate information. If you're a policymaker wanting to make good policies, if you're a lawyer wanting to present a good case, you need accurate information. And open source investigations are potentially really useful here. I don't think they're a complete panacea. I don't think we need to be romantic about their possibilities, but they definitely have potential to be used if they're carefully conducted. And in our book, it gives you a flavour of the state of play and the risks and the opportunities of this work. So thank you very much for listening, and we'll have questions later on, I think. Yeah, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really nice to see all of you. I'm Lucy. I've been asked to speak for 8 minutes, actually, about the special session on disarmament that Scrap's looking into convening, so that's what I'll be talking about today. In 2017, in a statement on the outcome of the final session of the open-ended working group on convening a 4th special session on disarmament, High Representative Azumi Nakamitsu said this: "The 3rd special session of the General Assembly devoted to disarmament, SSOD3, was convened nearly 30 years ago in 1988. Much has changed in the world since then." It's true. Much has changed in the world since then. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the invasion of Iraq 20 years ago next month, the ban on cluster munitions, the fall and then subsequent re-rise of Doctor Who, and most recently, Russia backing away from its New START commitments. I could go on. The world is, through some lenses, unrecognisable compared with that of the world of 1988. And yet, constant throughout all of this, from before the time of the 3 special sessions on disarmament, much of the framework for monitoring and enforcing arms control and disarmament remains identical. Let's take, for example, an old favourite, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Having entered into force in 1970, this treaty is literally old enough to be my dad. Its longevity, in the face of so much that has changed, is to be applauded. It survived the churn of new governments, seismic shifts in geopolitics, and it's lasted nearly twice the amount of time that Shakespeare's entire career did. But the Non-Proliferation Treaty, for all the good that it has done in the world, is grinding to a halt. One might argue that that halt has already happened. The UK announced an increase on the cap in its warheads by up to 40% in 2021, a decision which some senior academics have said would mark a stepping back from our NPT obligations. It certainly seems to me to violate both the spirit and the letter of NPT Article 6. We can't afford stagnation in this particular battle, even less backsliding. It is always absolutely necessary to remind those engaged in these debates that nuclear weapons have had and continue to have an outsized impact on indigenous communities, people of colour and women, and that a Red Cross study showed that even a limited nuclear war could lead, in quotation marks, a limited nuclear war could lead to massive global cooling, with a resultant famine killing up to 1 billion people. And it's not hypothetical either. This isn't something that might happen. It's not even something which did happen in 1945 and then stopped happening. The ongoing impact of historic nuclear testing and use, the astronomical damage that uranium mining, for example, does to communities, the coercion that nuclear weapons represent just by their very existence, these things show that nuclear weapons, whether used, tested, or just simply existing in the world, represent a major and ongoing injustice. The myth that nuclear weapons have kept the peace is only true if you look at the world through the narrow lens of a Western, white, rich man. And just as nuclear weapons haven't kept a just and meaningful peace, it also cannot be claimed that the NPT has been wholly successful in this either, given the lack of deep, just, and meaningful peace since its inception. That said, I understand the attachment to a treaty which has had such historic success and longevity as the NPT. It's an important pillar of the disarmament and non-proliferation establishment for a whole host of reasons. And of course, the role of the NPT is not just a sort of nebulous agenda for creating meaningful peace, but instead has quite a specific role in stopping the proliferation of a certain kind of weapon. But that just proves that we need to go further. Go beyond the old treaties and build something new if we are serious about creating peace. The good news is that there are new ways of thinking about disarmament which bring the vigour of a new generation, a new modality of thinking, and indeed a new world with its modern and different demands on disarmament. One example is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, a personal favourite of mine, which takes forward the Article 6 obligations of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, existing, in my view, perfectly compatibly with it. And scraps proposal for a special session on disarmament likewise present a framework for states to engage with disarmament outside the baggage of any one particular treaty. It provides the potential for a fresh start, a way to begin to unlock the deadlock on existing mechanisms we have for arms control and disarmament, such as the NPT. And not to make it all about me, but something else that's happened since the third special session in 1988 is my birth. I was born in 1998, well after the end of the Cold War, and when I talk to my peers, some of whom are here today, who are engaged in disarmament issues, I can feel the frustration simmering at the regimes which we have inherited for dealing with weapons of mass destruction of all kinds, and nuclear weapons in particular. I do not remember the Cold War, and I do not want my understanding of the possibilities of a more peaceful world to be strangled by its paradigms, including a belief that the NPT is somehow the best we can get. More than half of the world's population has been born since the third special session on disarmament, and yet, while 50% of the world's population is under the age of 30, only 2.6% of parliamentarians are in that age bracket. It is no surprise to me that disarmament is gaining popularity amongst those of my age, but we are not represented in decision-making spaces, and respected as well, which often means that the modes of thinking get stuck in the past. This is another reason that the special session on disarmament is exciting to me. A special session has not been convened since the Cold War, but in this particular case, without decades of back and forth stagnation, that provides an opportunity. The mechanism could be renewing, acting beyond Cold War mentalities and allowing genuinely open, creative thinking, bringing in young and diverse voices. Now, of course, if a special session is convened, the work will only just be beginning to ensure that this space is productive, representative, and creative, and that it centres the voices of those most affected by disarmament issues. But it can be ours to create. Much has changed in the world since 1988, and much has changed once more since 2017 when Izumi Nakamitsu said those words. We are here today on the first anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I do not think that the fallacy that nuclear weapons, indeed the existing arms control agreements, including the NPT, keep the peace, will be of any great comfort to those facing the destructions of their home and families. We must find a way forward which can create a genuine, lasting, and creative peace. When I talk to my peers in this space, there is creativity and there is willpower to break out of the stagnation of the old regimes and into something new. Perhaps a special session on disarmament could be the starting place for that. The world today looks and feels very different to the world of 1988. I've limited my comments mostly to talking about the nuclear regime, but one could equally well have made this intervention on the arms trade, on biological weapons, chemical weapons, cluster munitions. And one of the great things about a special session on disarmament is that it could shift the conversation away from this fragmented approach to eliminating and controlling different weapons types to a more holistic and practical proposal. It's not that a special session on disarmament proposes to throw out everything that's happened over the last 50 years or more, and I'm certainly not proposing that either. But it is vital that we create some spaces where we can go beyond the treaties, frameworks, and mindsets which have characterised non-proliferation and disarmament matters for so long, frameworks which are now demonstrably starting to fail. A special session on disarmament cannot come soon enough to create a new space for discussion and diplomacy beyond what we have come to think of as the same old forums. We must think more widely, make creative links, bring in more and new voices. Disarmament is urgent. We cannot wait for more NPT failed RevCons. I hope you will join me and Scrap in calling for a fourth special session on disarmament at the earliest possible moment. And if you're interested in how to do that, talk to Dan after the session.
I'm Martin Butcher. I am Oxfam's policy advisor on arms conflict and international humanitarian law. I joined Oxfam in 2010 as part of a large team working on the negotiation of the Arms Trade Treaty and have continued in similar issues ever since. Oxfam campaigns for in Yemen for an end to the conflict and for an inclusive peace agreement that takes into account the needs of the whole population, and in particular the most vulnerable, women, youth, and wider groups in civil society. I've been asked to talk about a report that I've just published with Oxfam, arming conflict or fueling conflict, the human impact of the war in Yemen. The reason that I wrote this report is that we've been involved in a practical attempt to hold the British government to account for arming that conflict, a court case to try and stop arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Oxfam has always had a role in challenging authorities. The incredibly courageous committee of people that started the organisation in Oxford in the 1940s collected food and clothing and blankets to deliver to a Greek island where the civilian population was starving, and to get that material there they faced down both Allied navies and the Nazis and simply refused to take no for an answer. So standing up to authority in order to help civilians is really what we do. We also have a strong belief in the role of international law in bringing about a reduction in human harm in conflict. And that was a big impetus for my report. That has also been reflected over nearly 30 years now in Oxfam's support for different disarmament agreements. There is as you'll know, a strand of disarmament that first became fashionable in the 1990s, known as humanitarian disarmament. I might challenge that label in some ways because I think all disarmament is in the end humanitarian. Everything that reduces conflict between states, everything that makes conflict less lethal is humanitarian, but the specific purpose of humanitarian disarmament agreements is to reduce civilian harm rather than to build state security through arms reductions. And Oxfam continues to work in that area. We base our work in the successfully adopted Arms Trade Treaty, an agreement which, to put it simply, says that the profits of the arms industry must be subordinated to human rights and international humanitarian law, that there are limits beyond which countries and arms traders must not go. I wouldn't pretend for a moment that we are entirely successful in that aim, but we have begun down what will be a long road. And so the work we're doing in Yemen now and the report that I wrote is part of that. The latest war in Yemen began in 2014, and the Saudi-led coalition started their intervention at the end of March 2015. This has had a sustained and major impact on Yemeni civilians. Over 4 million are displaced internally. Many of those have been displaced multiple times as the fighting has moved to different areas of the country. There have been a very large number of civilian casualties by some counts, if you include all kinds of deaths that could be said to result from the conflict, including disease, hunger, as well as direct casualties, that it's hundreds of thousands of people have died. 80%, more than 80% of the population, almost 24 million Yemenis, depend on humanitarian assistance to get by on a day-to-day basis. 13 million of those are children. Something like 25% of the population, 7.5 million, are suffering from malnutrition, including 2 million children. Clearly the work of a humanitarian agency like Oxfam and all the others who work there is absolutely essential, as is bringing an end to the war. So in my report, I looked specifically at the harm to civilians that we need to stop. I researched a period of 14 months leading up to the end of February 2022. And in that time, I found 1,727 military attacks which caused civilian harm, about 4 a day. 25% of those attacks were airstrikes by the Saudi-led coalition, and we know that they were by the coalition because they're the only combatants in Yemen who have an air force. 32% of the attacks were by artillery of varying kinds from all combatants. Overall, 85% of civilian harm in Yemen is caused by explosive weapons, bombs, missiles, artillery shells, and the other 15% by small arms. That's an important number because the long-term impact of the use of explosive weapons, particularly in populated areas, is much higher than that from the use of small arms and light weapons. You see the destruction of homes, the destruction of infrastructure, like electricity and water supplies, destruction of bridges and roads, other forms of transport, and the recovery of a country and of a civilian population after a war that involves heavy use of explosive weapons is much longer, much more expensive, and much more traumatic than one where explosive weapons are used less. 22% of attacks involved the displacement of civilians. 760 incidents in 14 months where people were driven from their homes or their place of safety. And as I said before, many people have been displaced multiple times, particularly in the fighting around the city of Marib. We've seen multiple attacks on camps for internally displaced people, and people being driven from one place they thought was safe to another, and then to another. The population of Marib has gone up from less than 1 million to way over 3 million because people fled there from other areas of Yemen, and then the fighting came to Marib. About 1,500 incidents involved what is known as psychosocial trauma. It's post-traumatic stress visited on civilians from either seeing their homes destroyed, seeing loved ones killed or injured, or any of the many other factors that come in. And this is something which also has a very long-term effect. That trauma stays with people for a lifetime. And it's a sad fact that a population that has been traumatized by violence in this way is more likely in the future to resort to violence to solve political problems later on. So that there is a real risk of a cycle of violence perpetuating itself. Another factor which has caused terrible damage to the civilian population is that many attacks, hundreds in the period I looked at, restrict the freedom of movement of civilians or the freedom of assembly of civilians. And this manifests itself in many ways. There was one attack that I looked at of people watching a football match and missiles fired into the crowd from outside the stadium. But it also means attacks on markets, on mosques, on schools, people unable to go about their daily lives because of the war. And again, this is part of what contributes to the psychosocial trauma that we talked about, but it has wider effects in society as well. About 15 attacks a month in the period studied were made on farms, and there's a particularly nasty example of modern warfare. A lot of landmines have been planted, a lot of cluster munitions have been used, and since the truce began about almost a year ago in Yemen, fighting has died down, and direct civilian deaths from the use of the immediate use of weapons has gone down about 20%. The fighting hasn't stopped, but it's lessened. But as people have tried to resume their normal daily lives, deaths from landmines, cluster munitions, and unexploded ordnance have gone up dramatically. And a country which is in desperate need of bringing back food production has been unable to recover in that way. So coming on to the arms control part of this from the civilian harm. The civilian harm explains why Oxfam wants arms control for the war in Yemen. And the arms control agreements can be very, very useful, not only in preventing war, but once war has started, in reducing harm within war and bringing an end to war. This war, the war in Yemen, is a civil war, but one which is heavily influenced by outside combatant parties and outside influences. The war would not be possible without the supply of arms from outside the country to all combatant parties, and without the support of outside parties for the combatants inside Yemen. in many ways, the people of Yemen are victims of power politics in the struggle between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and between their supporters in the wider world. The UK alone, since 2015, is estimated by researchers to have supplied about £23 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia and its allies in the Saudi-led coalition. That may be an underestimate. The US has supplied far more. One of the first acts of the war, in fact, demonstrates the dangers of the policy of arming for peace. The US government, prior to 2014, had given about $500 million worth of high-tech military equipment to the Yemeni armed forces, in an attempt to fight Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. As the war began, most of the army units that had been given that equipment defected from the government to the Houthi rebels. And ironically, the Houthi success in the first months of the war in capturing large parts of Yemen was because of US weapons that had been sold for an entirely different purpose. The subsequent arming of both sides from outside has kept the war going and intensified it. Whether that's weapons sold openly on the international market, or, as in the case from Iran, the smuggling of weapons into the country and technology. Cutting off this supply of arms would, at the very least, damp down the conflict. There is very little indigenous arms production in Yemen, although it's one of the sad facts in this area to emerge from the war is that technology transferred to in terms of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles and drones into the country now means that many fighters in Yemen have a very significant technological capability to produce that kind of weaponry. We have evidence, however, that cutting off the supply of arms, even now, has a positive effect. The Biden administration, while supplying ballistic missile defences and cruise missile defences to Saudi Arabia and the UAE after attacks on oil installations in those countries, cut off the supply of arms and the supply of spares that could be used to carry out attacks in Yemen. Subsequently, they told both those countries that until there was an ongoing positive peace process in which the coalition was engaged positively, there would be no restart of arms supplies. And this has had a very positive effect in stopping the aerial bombardment of Yemen and encouraging the coalition parties to negotiate more seriously than might otherwise have been the case. There's a long way to go, but arms control works. As a final note, I would say in this area, arms control and arms reductions, collection and destruction is going to be an absolutely vital part of any peace agreement in Yemen. The country is, as many countries are at the end of a long war, massively overarmed, and Yemen, in terms of personal firearms, was second only to the United States in the number of small arms per head before the war started. That number of weapons and larger weapons has dramatically multiplied in the last 7 or 8 years. We've taken the British government to court to try and stop one part of those arms supplies because there has to be accountability for actions, and international treaties like the Arms Trade Treaty are only effective if people who fought for them to be put into place fight for them to be properly implemented once they are in place. And that is what we are doing. We are saying there is obvious evidence of serious violations of international humanitarian law being carried out in Yemen with British weapons. So the sale of those weapons must stop until that is no longer the case. Preserving civilian life and preventing harm to civilians in conflict is a vital part of Oxfam's mission. And with my work and the work of many others in the disarmament sphere, hopefully we can make a lot of progress, not only in Yemen, but in Ukraine and elsewhere in the world in coming years. Thank you.
Thank you all for your interventions. There are a few questions online. You're welcome to stay seated and just turn the mic on to respond. But in the meantime, are there any questions from the people present here? I'll go online to give you guys some time to have a think. Our first question is from Rohan Mehta on Zoom. And the question is, what will be the response since Russia has suspended their participation in the New START treaty with America? And if this is a possibility, how can we guarantee assurance from the scrapping of nuclear weapons by each country?
Yeah, the Russian suspension of implementation of New START is both deeply regrettable and entirely unsurprising. And Dan talked before about, as did Lucy, about 20 years in which a whole infrastructure of arms control, disarmament and non-proliferation that had been put in place during the Cold War has been swept away. But at the same time, this is exactly the point at which we need to engage in rebuilding that infrastructure and building a new infrastructure for the new world in which we're living, and in some ways a more complicated world, because we have to pay much more account to China than was done during the Cold War. We need to engage seriously at unofficial track 2 levels and in official conversations about measures that as I just spoke about in the case of Yemen, but in Ukraine, in the wider world, make us much safer. Dan pointed out that the INF treaty is gone, but it's gone recently, so those arms have not been brought back, and that has meant that thousands of missiles that could have been fired at Ukraine are not there. So that it's even at the height of the Cold War, even at the worst moments of the Cold War, we were able in various ways to keep talking across those divides, and that's just the only way to carry on, really.
Would anybody else like to chip in, or shall I go to the next question?
I'll say a couple of words.
Okay.
Thanks, Sarah. I mean, yes, you've given a really useful intervention on that, Martin, and I think building on what Lucy said and what Dan said, there's a sense to which starting from thinking about Ukraine is a really difficult starting point, because it's not clear where the solution will come from. And of course, in that context, armaments seem an essential part of security. But I think with a broader sweep of history, there's a sense of, at those times, that's exactly the point when you should be thinking about options, so that as and when the world might be receptive to hear them, you have things that are ready to be considered. And drawing on the past is one way to do that, and that's Scrap's way, and also having new voices, thinking about new ways and disrupting tired thinking. I think there are some green shoots of optimism. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. There is another question from Sumit Kumar, who asked, is it not a conflicting situation where on one side we are discussing disarmament and weapons transparency, but on the other, NATO and Western-centric powers are providing weapons to Ukraine in a fight with Russia, but not doing enough to stop this war? I think this could also apply to the case of Yemen, if Martin would like to speak on that. And an additional part to that question is, do you think Western nations ever feel guilty or conflicted about having developed nuclear weapons? Because it's a genie that won't go back in its lamp. Who would like to start?
All right, I'll take the first part, but because I was thinking about that, I wasn't especially listening to the second part. So we might need to remind it. The first part, so from Oxfam's point of view, since I'm an Oxfam representative here, we're not opposed to the trade in arms. We're not opposed to countries implementing the right to self-defense. That's part of the international order. And the supply of arms to Ukraine to enable it to defend itself from what is obviously an illegal invasion and the destruction of swathes of its country is something that is entirely proper in international law. And the right of self-determination of peoples is also being upheld, another big part of the UN Charter. At the same time, as you say, as we've seen in Yemen, just fueling a war and doing nothing about the longer term is only half the answer at best. I haven't had a chance to look at the details yet, but while we've been here, there's a set of 12 principles from the Chinese government for principles for peace in Ukraine. And I mean, that's maybe a hopeful sign. I think I would have wished to see maybe different rhetoric, but it's not a situation where I think it would have been right to just leave the people of Ukraine to be overrun. What was the second part?
The second part was, do you think Western nations ever feel guilty or conflicted about having developed nuclear weapons because it's a genie that won't go back in its lamp, and because every country is working towards developing nuclear weapons in their arsenal to gain that edge and strength?
Conflicted, yes. Guilty, I doubt. It so happens it was something that came out of Western nations, but the physical principles behind nuclear weapons would have been discovered at some point by somebody. And I mean, in fact, you know, there is a uranium mine. God, I'm going to forget where it is now. But there is in Africa there is a uranium mine where there are small, slow chain reactions happening. So that physical principle existed in the world before it was discovered by people. And yes, it's not possible to put the genie back into the bottle. You can't just magic away nuclear weapons, but you can remove them from global arsenals, and you can put in place measures to stop people building them. That's actually relatively easy compared to other kinds of weapons because the infrastructure you need to make a nuclear weapon. I wish people felt guilty about it more than they do. I wish people felt more conflicted than they do, because if they did, they might be more willing to get rid of them. But hopefully that's a path we will get back on. And it's, you know, my generation has tried and failed, and Lucy is doing an absolutely marvellous job of leading the way now.
Yeah, I'd quite like to quickly come in on that. The phrasing, do Western states feel guilty, is really interesting because it sort of depends what we mean by states, in that can a state feel guilt? That's quite a kind of inherently human emotion. But I think what that speaks to is in this country, in the UK, we have the enormous privilege of living in a democracy, which means that if enough people in that democracy, I mean, theoretically, it means that if enough people in that democracy feel guilt about possessing nuclear weapons, that should cascade upwards and lead to change. And that's what makes me feel hopeful. And I think when we're talking about whether states feel guilty, to some extent, I mean, everybody here is responsible for that. And so if you feel guilty, then spread that.
I think that leads on to the next question very well, which is specifically for you. It's from Jan, and they ask, how can international disarmament communities engage with the voices of young people more? What do you think are the most important ways right now of supporting the youth ready to work for disarmament and contribute to peace efforts?
What an excellent question. I see my colleague Jake, sorry Jake to call you out, is just coming down the stairs. But Jake and I work together on a project called Youth for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It's this kind of youth-led, youth-run space which works towards platforming young voices in disarmament spaces. And I think that kind of project where young people are leading and young people are able to feed into the global conversation, but also not be limited by the thinking that has come before, are really important. And so one really practical thing that you can do if you want to support young people's voices in disarmament is fund young people, pay young people to think, and pay young people to do the work that historically young people have not been invited to do. So that's a really practical thing that we can do. More nebulously, it's important to be platforming young voices, so it's really great to be in a space like this where there are lots of young people around, and I mean, we're at a university and there's some really amazing young researchers that I think we're going to hear from in a minute who are doing really great work. So platforming is another really important thing. And also kind of being open to new ways of thinking. And yeah, I would say that they're kind of key principles, but also really remembering, sorry, this is quite a rambling answer, but really remembering that being a young person is often, by its nature, more precarious than other states of being. For example, young people are more likely to be in insecure housing, they're more likely to be in insecure work and be underpaid for their labour or not be paid at all for their labour. And so bearing those things in mind when you engage with young people, bearing in mind that bandwidth is difficult, especially when there are so many other existential issues that are competing for people's time, climate change being the key one. And so being open, but also being ready to meaningfully fund and think about new ways of thinking, I think they're the really key things. Anyone else want to come in on that?
Thank you so much. Before we wrap up, are there any questions from the room? Yes, back.
I'm going to take a seat. Thank you so much. I think it was such a great learning experience hearing you all, and also to know about all the great work that you all are doing, especially with the verification, and I think the capacity building for governments or think tanks. I actually wanted to comment a bit on the very title for today's conference. It says, "Today's era must not be a war." And I think even though the Financial Times and the likes of those newspapers take this very literally, I would rather have to say that these are just empty words, but it's rather hypocritical of someone like Prime Minister Modi to even say these words. And that's that's rather because him and like the likes of his predecessors in India have a very violent strategy policy in Kashmir, which is the world's largest, most militarized zone. So this is a hypocritical statement. And because it's the title for today's conference, I just wanted to ask about how do you think that you get countries, or rather governments like India, accountable for their war crimes and human rights violations and all of their arms deals with US or Israel, in terms of like their allyship with the West? And you can clearly see this is that you don't hold countries like India accountable for their crimes because they are your strategic ally against China, against Russia. And so a lot of their crimes don't make it to the UN or to like a lot of platforms because it's very smart thinking, because the West doesn't have like economic interests maybe in Kashmir, or because this is not Russia or this is not China that you're talking about, but it's India. So how do you get countries like India to be held accountable? And how do you actually also think of involving international neutral organizations in regions like Kashmir, where you actually have India not allowing international organizations to come in and take in data or like verify? So I don't think, and with all the also tech-savvy lockdowns that you have of India in Kashmir with the communications blockade and the whole of internet banning for like 2 years, there's not much you can do with verification in terms of satellite or like just international organizations going there and taking data, because that's not allowed, it's not permitted. So how do you, I have just these two questions. How do you get a country like India to be held accountable when they have such great allyship, and how do you get involved in regions where you're not allowed to be going there to take in data? So there's basically no data to be held accountable for. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Really important question, and you raised some really important themes. I'm afraid I don't have any easy answers. I completely recognise the situation you're describing, and we could mention other places in the world that similar dynamics are happening. So the question: how do we build accountability? I think it's really difficult. I think I could give you some sort of principles that transparency matters. It matters to the victims. They want to be known. They want the violations to be known about. So it's important that people carry on trying to collect robust data and store it before it disappears. In places where there's where it's blacked out and you can't get anywhere. Well, I don't know the situation you're describing, so I don't know the extent to which it's true. I know in general, data does often find a way out around the cracks, and organisations like Oxfam and ACLED have found ways to find it. It's not very satisfying because it takes a long time to collect and verify data, and then it takes an even longer time to find ways to use it. But it's the start, and I hope it's better than nothing. Martin, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, it is extraordinarily difficult, and I think there are maybe a couple of answers, both of which are unsatisfactory, but both point away to the future. The first is that the arrangement in the UN Security Council and in global institutions that was arrived at the end of World War II is manifestly no longer useful in the way it is set up for the current world, and has to be reformed. And in particular, the way in which all 5 permanent members of the Security Council use their veto in that body to protect violations of the laws of war and human rights abuses by allies and client states is appalling and needs to be brought to an end. that's something which a lot of people have been thinking about for quite a long time, but there is, I think, slowly a head of steam building up behind that. That is not something that will be done quickly and easily, but it does point the way to a future where challenging those power structures is easier. The second is, even in situations where getting data about violations out is really, really hard, I think Henrietta's right, ways are found. All 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when I got into this field, satellite photos were something only governments had access to. Now, NGOs I work with routinely buy satellite photos of the most secret areas for £200 or £300. So it's well within the reach of almost everybody to access pretty much everywhere on Earth. So information finds a way out. And we have a process parallel to the court case in this country that I talked about, where human rights organisations in Yemen have collected data about violations of international humanitarian law in that country to an evidentiary standard necessary to go to the International Criminal Court and try to launch cases against combatant parties in Yemen. That's something which can be replicated in other places, and the means to do that are improving almost on a daily basis. So I absolutely recognise the problems that you have described, and that some situations are much harder than others. But I would be optimistic in the long term.
My name is Sasha, and I work closely with an organisation called HWPL. And I think this can be for any of you, but maybe particularly you, Martin, might find it interesting. A group called ILC, International Law Committee, drafted a new international law. From what you were saying, you said strong belief in international law is very important. Kind of what you were saying as well, Lucy, when you were speaking, that the UN, the Security Council, many of the policies that have been made are very, very much outdated for today. We've brought the law to the UN and things like this, and it is being reviewed. But I wanted to ask you, what do you think are some of the barriers from any one of your perspective of why we are not coming together to implement these kinds of things and speak louder about changing international laws? Because when I come to many events like this, everyone speaks about it, everyone says oh, we should do it. But what do you think the barriers are to actually having these changes made in this generation so that we don't repeat the same mistakes every generation?
Since you asked, that's to me, the answer is power. The people that have the power don't want things to change. The Western states who have aligned to support Ukraine have, in the past year, an exemplary record of calling out all kinds of violations of international humanitarian law and the jus ad bellum before that, with respect to Russia's actions. Those same states sponsor or carry out very similar crimes in many places across the world. And it's a principle for us that international law must be universally applied if it is to be meaningful. So I think that's the answer, really. It's power.
Okay, thank you for joining us today. We have a project assistance panel now. And before I introduce the panel, I would like to introduce our amazing speakers. I would first like to start with Mona Lisa Hazarika, who is joining us from India and is up on the screen behind us. Mona Lisa is a master's student in conflict management and development at Banaras Hindu University, India, and is interested in the nexus between narco-insurgency, arms trade, and the illicit trafficking of small arms and light weapons. She was selected as one of 25 Leaders for Tomorrow by the UNODA, the UNODA's Youth for Disarmament initiative, to advance the role of youth in the decision-making process, and was invited to the UN headquarters in New York to present her project Across the Chicken Neck at the first committee side event held in October 2022. Currently, she's working as a project assistant at Scrap Weapons and is part of the Emerging Voices Network of BASIC. Our next speaker is Dr. Gurpreet Kaur, who is an intersectional gender specialist. She received her BA Honours and MA degrees from the National University of Singapore and her PhD from the University of Warwick. She has just completed her LLM in Human Rights, Conflict and Justice from SOAS and is now a project assistant with Scrap Weapons. We also have James Luke, who is an MSc student in political thought at SOAS and a project assistant at Scrap Weapons as well. He previously studied political science at the University of Notre Dame and has experience living and working in Hong Kong, Jerusalem, the US, France, and the UK. Luke is passionate about critical approaches to security, and his latest article, published on the Scrap Weapons opinion page, conducts a critical military analysis of a potential Taiwan Strait confrontation. He is currently interested in research of the impact of surveillance and violence on the creation of cyber ethics. Our final speaker is Indrajit Ramananand, who is currently an MSc student in international politics at SOAS. He completed his BA LLB degree at OP Jindal Global University, India, specializing in international law and politics. Indrajit is interested in the contemporary nuclear strategies in South Asia, focusing on the Indian nuclear weapons program. So we have quite the panel here today with a whole list of accomplishments. And today they will be focusing on why we need a special session on disarmament. So, the New World Order comprises multiple power blocks and is no longer split between the power dynamics of the two giants of the Cold War. Potential conflict has increased nuclear and non-nuclear weapons proliferation surrounding the Taiwan Strait, the India and Pakistan border, and India and Russia-Ukraine. Increasing gun violence and a culture of arms have intensified the former threats posed by nuclear proliferation with greater rigor and localized impacts. New and emerging technologies are blurring the demarcations between wartime and peacetime with indiscriminate weaponry such as killer robots or lethally armed weapons that contribute to the epidemic of violence against historically marginalized groups with their gender-biased and racist algorithms. With the world facing numerous security challenges, including the gendered impact of conflict and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, on the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Russia's recent withdrawal from the New START Treaty, a special session on disarmament in 2023 is needed now more than ever to identify concrete measures to strengthen disarmament and arms control efforts, including those related to the gendered impact of armed conflict. This session would also assess progress made in the implementation of existing disarmament communities and explore innovative ways to build trust among nations. So this was a statement written by our panel, and Mona Lisa, I would like to start with you and ask you the very purpose of why we are here. Why do you think we need a special session on disarmament? And a follow-up to that would be, do you think we are being trapped in a Cold War narrative, and do you think we are trapped by our views on the Cold War when it comes to disarmament?
Yeah, absolutely, Zahra. I think I'll just briefly go over what is a special session on disarmament. So it was first conducted in 1978 when the UN member states, particularly the non-aligned countries, requested a special session of the General Assembly devoted entirely on disarmament. So this request was made in regards to the limited possibilities for discussions provided by a regular session of the General Assembly, and was perceived as an opportunity to discuss comprehensive disarmament in a particularly universal forum. So the last session was held in 1988, and of course, a lot has changed since then. So with the new global order, the power dynamics are no longer split between the two directional giants of the West and the East, while nuclear weapons are still pose the overarching existential threat, but are no longer just limited to those two blocks. At present, there are 9 nuclear weapon states, along with 5 other countries which are known to host these weapons in their territories. Also important here is that this gradual shift of power to the East, the 21st century has been dubbed as the Asian century, and of course for good reason. Today the region has an increasing global share of trade, capital, people, knowledge, transport, culture, and resources. But also important to flag here is that this region is also the largest importer of weapons. With new and emerging technology, our world has engaged in this hybrid warfare where the lines between humanity and warfare has been blurred with indiscriminate autonomous weapons like the killer robots, which are known to have inherent gender and racist biases. And to answer your second part of your question, do we still have the Cold War attitudes? I said yes, because Cold War ideology still persists today. We still try to understand international reality in military terms. So this wartime economy has not only resulted in huge divestments from public sectors, but has also fostered these attitudes of mistrust and a permanent armament industry. The doomsday clock, of course, which stands now at 90 seconds to midnight, is a clear indication of that.
Thank you, Mona Lisa. Indrajit, I see you nodding along if you'd like to jump in.
So I actually quite agree with Mona Lisa on this point, but it's not just that the Cold War attitudes have persisted in terms of how we think of these weapons, not just the rationale of these weapons, but the rationale of our solutions as well. So in terms of how we think about disarmament is also very much rooted in this Cold War mentality, Cold War attitude towards the mistrust and the sort of fear-mongering of the ideology of these weapons. I think I actually had to deal with a few diplomats on these issues. And while talking to them, I did realize that it's not just that they think about these weapons as essential, but the ideology with which they approach why these weapons are necessary sort of points to how they look at these, how they look at the issue of disarmament as utopian to begin with. And that is one of the biggest drivers of change which you want, which actually points to another issue which Gurpreet had talked about, is the dominance of the male, sort of masculine agenda when we talk about weapons, nuclear weapons and disarmament as well. I would let Gurpreet talk more about that.
Thank you, Indrajit. I think following on from both Mona Lisa and Indrajit, I think one of the things that we need to recognize today, especially in 2023, is that disarmament is actually deeply connected to other systems of peace and development. And bringing on, the gendered aspect of this is that arms proliferation specifically is embedded into systems such as patriarchy, heteronormativity, racism, ableism, wealth inequality. And these are intersecting vectors and identities held by different groups and communities that inform their relationship to weapons and arms proliferation. The issue is not just related to nuclear weapons, which are associated with male virility through language and symbolic associations to state power and security. They are also related to small arms and light weapons that facilitate sexual and gender-based violence against women. So it relates to a broader issue where intimate partner violence is involved. It even encompasses the sphere of domestic violence. And bringing on your point about, this utopic ideology, which is also very much steeped in a sort of like a gender hierarchy where nuclear states, or states which actually have a lot of these arsenal of weapons, are somehow seen as very, very empowered and masculine states, whereas those who talk about disempowerment or who are not in that narrative are feminine states. And there's a sort of like, when you talk about disempowerment and letting go of certain things, there is this idea of, this is emasculating. We don't project that kind of power. And this is a very, very strong narrative that is there, but no one is actually willing to talk about the gendered aspects of these issues, where it's not just about how, it's not a symbolic currency, but how women are disproportionately affected, LGBTQI communities are disproportionately affected, disabled communities are, not brought onto the table. There is wealth inequality. There is also the question of what we would call as nuclear colonialism, where a lot of indigenous communities are being affected by uranium mining. And it's the states who are actually in power who kind of dump all the nuclear waste on, other indigenous communities that is there. So there's a lot of, these intersections and communities that are actually not being brought up to the table, but particularly the patriarchal aspects that we need to talk about. And I think James can actually elaborate more on the kind of colonial dynamics that are there and take us through that that narrative.
Yeah, of course. I think while we were talking a little bit about there being separate power blocks and the current day situation not really representing a more Cold War era style of relations, I think while of course we're at SOAS, we have to interrogate the colonial and also imperialistic view of kind of the current day order as well. And more specifically, as someone growing up, who grew up in Hong Kong, I'm very concerned about U.S.-China relations and what that means, and also kind of what I'm seeing as a rhetoric of fear, I guess, promulgated by both the U.S. side and the Chinese side, that is kind of fueling this arms race in Asia, that is actually detrimental for human security of local communities and me and my family living in Hong Kong right now. And I think if we look at the U.S. Department of Defense says the Chinese rocket force is one of the most dangerous forces and most rapidly growing forces in the world. But if you look at the numbers and look at the actual military balance, the numbers does show an actual difference in that analysis. If we look at the Chinese nuclear warheads arsenal, and China has 350 nuclear warheads, but the US has 5,428. And if we even look at just conventional weapons and conventional missiles, China has an inventory of 2,000 conventional and nuclear missiles, whereas simply just the US itself, with its Navy roaming around the South China Sea with 10 to 14 cruisers or destroyers, each armed with Tomahawk missiles, and the US has around 4,000 in its inventory, and with plan and also has the ability to use JASSM missiles, which are joint air-to-surface standoff missiles that can be deployed from anywhere from transport aircrafts to trucks to traditional fighter jets, and the U.S. has currently 5,000 of them, with plans to buy as many as 10,000 of them, which vastly outnumbers China's, I guess, inventory of just 2,000. And there is this rhetoric of fear that is also promoting this arms race, which you can see in Japan as well, with Japan's recent purchase of 500 Tomahawk missiles from the U.S. And there's this very masculine terminology used with defense by deterrence and this arms race that's kind of detrimental to human security, building off from that.
I actually also wanted to ask you, developing on that, how do you feel about the justification for militarization and increased defense spending, which has percolated into our society? Mona Lisa, I know you mentioned your program called Across the Chicken Neck, which focuses on the militarization of Northeast India. How do you feel that this has been justified there, and is there a need, and what threats have weapons proliferation posed in your local context as well?
Yes, so the Across the Chicken Neck is a program that I created in collaboration with the Youth for Disarmament Initiative of the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs. So as part of my training, I created this educational program which aims to accentuate the importance of disarmament education among youth across the globe, with special reference to the indigenous communities of Northeast India. So this project is basically a product of my lived experiences with armed conflict conducted by insurgent groups and separatist groups, and also the impact of illicit trade in small arms and narcotics across the porous borders. So if you've ever seen the Indian map, if you've paid attention, the northeastern part of the country is connected to said mainland India by a narrow 21-kilometer strip of land, which is called the Chicken Neck, hence comes the name Across the Chicken Neck. So as a youth and an indigenous woman growing up, I could see the first-hand impact of what weapons could do to the social fabric of community, so much so that the weapons and military presence has been normalized in the region. So this project has been highlighting the various cross-cutting issues of this region, including the porous international borders. So we have 98% of our borders are international. We share them with China, Myanmar, Bhutan, Nepal, and Bangladesh. So the close proximity to the Golden Triangle brings in the problem of narcotics within the region. Then we have post-colonial realities fueled by racism. There's also the issues of indigenous rights, human rights violation with a barbaric law called the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, AFSPA, which has been imposed since the early 1950s, and also the problem of uranium mining in the region. So in this regard, there's a lot to unpack through this project. And to answer your question, the problems that we have been facing is mostly, it just goes back to weapons proliferation, especially small arms, how they have been traded and smuggled across these borders since the independence of our country. And people, I guess, have just gotten so used to this problem, or I guess have sidelined to the point that this military-industrial complex that has been, like you said, percolated into our society, that it's just been dubbed as that's the way of the world, or I think a more appropriate one would be guns don't kill people, people kill people, right? But then we are, I guess, conveniently forgetting the fact that it's just us people who are killing these other people. So we are so blinded by this overload of information where we hear cases of deaths with like new and improved weapons, and this humane picture behind these figures and these data is somehow lost. The families and the generations who have to bear the brunt of these weapons and these conflicts are just, I guess, again, I'm rambling, but then this is something so close to my heart that it's not really, I guess, brought to the international level, which is the reason why I created this project. And also to, I guess, highlight how this humanitarian impact of such decisions is conveniently overlooked by the people who says that disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control is a utopic thing, and the world is always at war, and this is how the world functions.
I think I just want to jump in here and add to what Mona Lisa has said, that through the effects on indigenous communities, what we are seeing is a lot of intersectional and interlinking of these concepts. So a lot of the issues that we are dealing with are also that there is an effect on the environment, right? Arms, and nuclear weapons. They actually, it's not just a biodiversity loss, but indigenous communities are actually being affected. So it is how again a disproportionate gender effect comes in, where a lot of indigenous communities depend on their women to walk miles and miles to fetch clean water, and if that is affected, that is not available, and they have to walk through the forest to collect fuel for firewood for fuel. So it is all an interlinked arena where you can't just talk about, say, disarmament doesn't affect this, or it only affects biodiversity, it doesn't affect that. It is all linked, and at the heart of it, we are talking about women, we are talking about marginalized communities, but also today's biggest threat, something that I think Lucy even touched on, is climate change. We are looking at how a lot of the weapons and the military complex actually contributes to a lot of the greenhouse emissions as well, and how in order to kind of combat that, you're putting in more arsenal that actually creates more of this as well. So I don't think it's a question of we can kind of look at it, these issues like in a like the Cold War framework of there were two blocks of power or just two hierarchies that are there. I think a lot of new voices and issues and are coming in that need to be brought to the table. So
just building off of that, I think we had a question earlier talking about how we can get countries like India to sort of play a bigger role in disarmament. So I think what Mona Lisa and Gurpreet have said is sort of, it gives away why sort of in the global south disarmament is such a controversial issue. Because when we think about weapons in general and nuclear weapons in particular, we can think about it in three dimensions. The first will be state-on-state violence, the second would be state-on-human violence, and the third would be human-on-human violence. As far as countries of the global south, especially India, is concerned, their nuclear weapons program and their strategic thinkers think about nuclear weapons only as state-on-state violence. They do not consider the other two dimensions at all. And even when we are talking about disarmament from a Cold War perspective, the most we can do is the second dimension, that is state-on-human violence, or state-on the effect on environment, or how it's causing loss of biodiversity. But the things which you and Monalisa talked about, these three things are sort of showing how these issues are interlinked. And the best way to get this agenda sort of bigger voice in Global South is through focusing on this third dimension, this new dimension, to bring it in voices of disarmament, essentially.
Thank you so much. I am just a bit conscious of time, and therefore I would like to ask if there are any questions from the room. But in the meantime, there has been a question on the chat that I would like to ask you. Scrap Weapons, from its start, has included youth perspectives in its design and rollout. What do you think is the strength of this approach, and can you tell us more about how the project is led by and engages student voices? As our student voices, what do you think?
Yeah, I guess with Scrap, we currently have a couple different work streams, and I'm working on the military balance work stream, and I think Gurpreet is working on the gender work stream, and there's also a small arms producers work stream, and they're all led by students, and yeah, I think we each get to kind of direct the work stream towards our interests and towards our local context and our own experiences, and we have articles coming out on our opinions page, our op-eds, blog posts, and to get more youth voices out there, and Scrap's a good platform for that. And yeah, that's kind of small steps that we're taking, I think.
Yeah, I just want to add that I think in that sense, Scrap is amazing because it actually listens to student voices. It gives us a chance to place our opinions and even disagree with our with our supervisors and professors. And in that sense, I think Scrap is doing quite a lot.
I would just like to add that I have been directing the gender intersectionality and disarmament stream, and it's been amazing because I have had so much freedom to work on it and direct it in the way we need to go. So the intersectional aspects that I've been talking about, that's core of the stream that we are talking about. So we are talking about gender, sexuality and disarmament, gender and environment and disarmament, et cetera, et cetera. So we are really, I think, bringing out a lot of the issues that are first and foremost affecting a lot of the youth and trying to highlight youth voices and other marginalized voices that matter. And I think Scrap is leading in that. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Sorry, go on, Ronald.
Sorry, Zara. Yes, I just wanted to add to what Gurpreet already mentioned about the different initiatives that Scrap is taking. I would like to talk about the webinar series that my team is working on. It's called the In Conversations with the Arms Industry, which is basically, it's scheduled to start from April, which invites actors from the alleged shadow world to partake in a series of open dialogues and provides a practical insights to the arms industry, its preoccupations, and its own understanding of the role in their work. Also, through this webinar series, we will be addressing a variety of themes and issues relating to, well, the business of that, like it's dubbed, by seeking to understand what key challenges these actors face to meet the expectations of ethical conduct and creating a space for conversations that leads toward a safer and peaceful world. And so our main aim is to recenter this debate around the ethics, the laws and regulation which governs these arms trade, and narrowing the gap between the social responsibilities and the on-the-ground realities. Over to you, Zara.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions in the room or online? In that case, I would actually like you to respond to the previous question that was asked about our title. What are your thoughts on states being held accountable to what they say?
The question was asked, particularly in India's case, to be held. India's issue with Kashmir is sort of the major highlight because it's such an international issue. But the truth is, as Monalisa has also pointed out, India has a lot of human rights issues all over its territories. I'm also from West Bengal, which has a part of the chicken's neck in it. I've also lived in sort of areas which were affected by Maoist insurgencies and Naxal insurgencies, and I've seen that firsthand. I've seen that violence firsthand myself. In that sense, holding India, countries like India accountable is, as I mentioned, like you have to focus on the third dimension of the violence, which is human-on-human violence. India will always, essentially any country in the global south which wants to be taken seriously in the nuclear five, will always focus on state-on-state violence, because, I mean, nuclear colonialism or nuclear orientalism is a reality for the diplomatic future of these countries. But in terms of in terms of holding them accountable for what is going on and advancing a serious debate on disarmament here requires us to look at, requires us to force these countries to look at themselves in a way which is commensurate not with the agenda of nuclear weapons or the international order, but of essentially of violence and weapons at a much smaller scale, because that is what will build up that tension in the public, because at the end it is a democracy. And as we said, that there's this trickle-down democracy concept, and that may work at some level, hopefully.
James, I would like to ask your opinion on this outside of the India context.
Sure. I will take a creative spin off that. I think based on my research, I think it's important to look at capabilities and not simply just what states say or intentions or representations, and I think data speaks for itself, and sometimes I think it's important to include both the data and also I guess dialogue as well.
All right, thank you all so much for joining us for this panel, and thank you guys for introducing and discussing aspects of disarmament that are usually not brought up from all walks and different levels of society and life. So thank you so much. Dan's creeping up, so I will now pass on to Professor Plesh for some closing remarks. Thank you.
Thanks particularly to Zara, who's put all this whole thing together. Great job sharing just now. Thank you. To close, I want to thank our representative from Sokogai International, from Oxfam, my colleagues and our student body for a great discussion, and thanks very much to all of those who participated online. Our title, that today's era must not be of war, is taken from the G20 summit. And I think it epitomizes the dilemma of states. And we respect the leadership of the G20 under Indonesia, and now this year of India, and we look forward to working with the Indian government and next year with Brazil to make that a statement that so excited the Financial Times, that today's era must not be of war, into a reality. And what drives this, of course, is that states who have cultures, as we've heard, to some extent built with a very strong, understandable military component, understand that in today's world, war can be horrifically self-destructive for everybody, for the whole planet. And that dilemma, how we deal with our historical roots and history and pride, and as our representative said, how we take that and take the claws out from this dilemma is the critical one. And if we, in our expert team and our distinguished group of advisors, former officials, and our youth leadership can help the G20, then we look forward to doing that. Thank you all very much.